Let's talk more about preventing child neglect. What do you know about child neglect? Child neglect is a serious and pervasive issue. Let's dig a little deeper. There are 4 sections to this training. You have already completed Explore the Basics, where we defined the many forms of child neglect. Now, let's examine the kinds of assumptions we all may have about child neglect. There are additional resources available on the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Fund's website, ctfalliance.org, and on the website for the National Child Abuse and Neglect Technical Assistance and Strategic Dissemination Center, CANTASD, a service of the Children's Bureau, at www.cantasd.org. So let's think together about our own beliefs and assumptions about child neglect. Are they fact or are they fiction? We often make assumptions about child neglect based on what we believe to be facts. For instance, we know as a fact and through our own experience that all roses are flowers. However, we should not assume, based on that knowledge, that all flowers are roses. We surveyed parents and practitioners from multiple family-serving fields about whether they believed these common assumptions about child neglect were fact or fiction. What do you think? Poverty is always the cause of child neglect. Poverty can be a risk factor for child neglect. However, it is important to remember that most families living in poverty do not neglect their children.
I started to talk to you about not having car fare to actually take my son to school. Several things could have happened depending on the decision that I would make in order to get him to school or not get him to school. So if I don't have the car fare to get him to school and I make the decision not to take him to school, then that becomes potentially child neglect, educational neglect. So that's a situation where my family is put in, and it's not intentional, but it has to do with my economics, what I have or don't have.
Let's examine another common assumption about child neglect. What do you think? Child neglect doesn't occur as often as child abuse. This statement is simply not true. Child neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment. Every year, more than 75% of all child maltreatment cases in the United States involve child neglect. What do you think about this? Do you believe the common assumption that child neglect isn't as serious or damaging to a child as child abuse? This is also fiction. Research has shown that some of the possible long-term effects of child neglect include cognitive and academic deficits, social withdrawal and limited peer interactions, and violent and criminal behavior. The data tells us that physical abuse and sexual abuse has declined in the past 5 years. However, child neglect trends have not declined and continue to rise. Let's hear from a child abuse and neglect professional about these trends and how the data can empower us to be involved.
Neglect is a serious and pervasive problem in our nation, and the good news is that it's preventable. Approximately 80% of all referrals to Child Protective Services are about neglect. 80%. And each year, almost 1,600 children die from child abuse and neglect. That's 4 children every day. Of that number, more than 70% suffered neglect either alone or in combination with another form of abuse. And the most vulnerable among us are the little ones, the 1 to 5-year-olds, who make up more than 50% of the numbers I just mentioned. So neglect seems to be at the heart of most referrals, but we can change that if we all share the responsibility for making it happen. I challenge you to consider your own attitude about neglect and begin to ask yourself, do I know enough? Can I learn more and do more? In my family, am I promoting empathy and compassion so that children develop a sense of responsibility beyond themselves? And in my community, do I look for and support families who might need help? What are you doing to promote policies, both locally and nationally, that adequately support families who need help? If each one of us is proactive in our efforts to recognize and eliminate this most prevalent and deadly form of child maltreatment, we can ensure that the children in our communities and throughout the nation grow up safe, cared for, and free from harm.
Let's turn now to another common assumption. What do you think? People who neglect their children don't really love them. This may seem to be the simplest way to explain neglect. The truth is, most parents love their children, but may struggle to provide for their needs.
No one sitting around this group has ever said to another parent that you doubted that they loved their children.
Oh, no. No.
You know,
I tell them I know.
We know that love and neglect are not tied together.
I tell people that. I tell professionals that when I go out and do public speaking. I tell them, you know, I may have made bad choices and neglected my kids, but don't think for a second that I didn't love them.
And I think that's a message that a lot of professionals need to hear.
I agree.
Is that love and neglect, they are not tied together.
What about this common assumption? Fact or fiction? What do you think? If parents would do a better job of parenting, there wouldn't be any child neglect. Child neglect isn't just a family matter. If we all did a better job of helping to build strong families and communities, we could help prevent child neglect. Here's another assumption that's often stated as fact. Perhaps you've heard it. Some cultures are more likely to neglect their children than others. On closer examination, it's clear that child neglect crosses all cultural, economic, geographic, social, religious, and ethnic boundaries. Stop for a moment and consider culture. Culture is literally woven into everything about us. Our stories and histories, our beliefs, our traditions, our attitudes. Everything that makes us who we are is tied to culture. It is wise to carefully consider our own assumptions, because preventing child neglect is everyone's responsibility. Consider what you can do at each level, as an individual, in your family and relationships, in your community and neighborhood, and in our society as a whole. The good news is that when we all work together, child neglect is preventable. Let's be sure we base our prevention efforts on fact, not fiction. There is so much more to learn. In the next section, we will learn about strategies that will enable us to take an active role in preventing child neglect by helping our own and other families build protective factors as a shield against the risk factors that can contribute to child neglect. Support for this training was provided by the Office on Child Abuse and Neglect, Children's Bureau, Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, through the National Child Abuse and Neglect Technical Assistance and Strategic Dissemination Center, CANTASD, contract number HHSP 233-201-400025C, in partnership with the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds. CANTASD is funded by the Office on Child Abuse and Neglect to create resources and develop peer learning activities, including the National Conferences on Child Abuse and Neglect, for those engaged in primary prevention and early intervention to promote the safety and well-being of children, youth, and families. The National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds provides training, technical assistance, and peer consulting opportunities to state children's trust and prevention funds, and strengthens their efforts to prevent child abuse and neglect. Parents from the Birth Parent National Network, BPNN, helped to provide the video conversations in these learning sequences. The BPNN is an expanding national network of hundreds of birth parents and organizations working together to support families and influence child welfare systems. It is supported by the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds and Casey Family Programs.